I'd like to now introduce this incredible book that I had the opportunity to recently read called The Unquiet Dead, written by Stacie Murphy, who's with us here today. It's a great book, but it's also a really fun book. And as much as you can say you have fun books about people who are dead and ghosts and possessed, it is a murder mystery. It is a period piece. It's got elements of science fiction and fantasy. And it's got really great social commentary, something that you would not expect from a turn-of-the-century piece. And I say turn of the century because I was born in the 20th century, so I mean the 19th. And so with that, I strongly encourage you, after you hear this, I think after you hear Stacie speak, you're probably going to absolutely want to go out by and read the book if you haven't already, but I strongly encourage you to do it. It's a great read. And I will also add one last thing. This book is a sequel. It's a second book in a series, but I didn't know that when I first started reading it, and it's a book that you can actually read on its own without knowing that there's a first book, and then you go back because you want to read what happened in the beginning. But so rarely do sequels let you do that. And that's an incredible ability of a writer to be able to self-contain a book where so much information has actually taken place in another book. So I encourage you to read both books. I haven't had the chance to read the first one yet, but I'm going to go back because I want to know what happened, and I encourage you to do the same. So with that, Stacie Murphy.
Thank you.
And hi, I'm Jenny Yacovissi. I am the president of Washington Independent Review of Books. We're an online book review site. We review 5 days a week, and I encourage you to find us online. I am here to chat with Stacie Murphy today, and I will tell you that I have read both books, and I highly recommend both of them. And one of the things that I noticed on Stacie's website is that she jokes that she started writing her book, A Deadly Fortune, the first book, in 2017 as a way of not being on Twitter in the evenings. And apparently it didn't work, but she wrote a book. And the fact that you and we have bugs. Oh,
bug
good.
got me.
The fact that you started writing a book in 2017, you now have 2 published books, and it's only 2022. To me, that's a land speed record. So I presume that you were doing writing besides on Twitter before you started writing your first book.
Honestly, no. My background, I was an English major in college. So my undergraduate degree is in literature, but it was the reading side, not the writing side. And I had always wanted to have written a book, but I was not doing anything to actually make that happen. And I will go modestly political here because it's relevant to the context of why I started writing the first book. I worked for 15 years as a lobbyist for a nonprofit that worked on international reproductive health and rights. And as you might imagine, in 2017, my day job was really stressful. Some things had happened recently that made that a really stressful place to be. And I was literally on Twitter or March 2017, and I was looking at the outrage of that particular 30-minute period, because as you will remember, they were coming very frequently, and I just had this moment where it was like, oh, I'm not going to make it. I'm going to have a stroke if I don't have something else to think about over the next couple of years. I've got to get out of this mind space where I'm just all absorbed by what's going on. And I always wanted to have written a book, and there were just a lot of things at that particular time that made it the right moment. I wasn't 40 yet, but I could see 40 coming. My daughter was a little over a year old, and I could see how fast she was growing, and I had that sense of time passing. And I just had the realization that I was finally at a point where I was more afraid to find out what happened if I didn't try it. I was more afraid of not trying than of trying and finding out that I would fail. And because that's why I hadn't done it before. I just always had this sense that, like, what if I can't do it? And so I thought, okay, this is the moment. This is not going to happen unless I decide to make it happen. And so I'm going to lean into this, and I'm going to give everything I can and just see what happens. And A Deadly Fortune was the result.
Well,
so.
and you knocked it out of the park on,
Thank you.
on your first try. And one of the things that you mentioned is that you were and of course I'm going to blank out on what it's the Pitch Wars.
Yes.
why I couldn't come up with that. Anyway, that you were part of Pitch Wars, and that's one of the things that I would love to hear a little bit about how that works, what that is for writers.
So unfortunately, Pitch Wars announced this year that that was going to be their last year, so they've done it. But it was a wonderful mentorship competition, and if you were here for the speaker who was here before, Ashley Winstead, who wrote In My Dreams I Hold a Knife, she was a Pitch Wars contestant the same year as me, so I got to meet her a minute ago. We knew each other online, but we had not met in person. So Pitch Wars was a mentorship competition where unagented writers would apply to the program, and if you got selected, you worked with an agented or published author, somebody who's a little further ahead of you on the journey, to do a round of revisions on your book. And so and then there's a showcase for literary agents. And I applied thinking I was mostly done with my book. And I got picked to participate, and the mentor who picked me was wonderful, but she said, look, you've got a plot point in the middle of this book that lets all the tension out. You really need to rewrite the second half. And I spent 24 hours really mad about it. I spent 24 hours not sure that I wanted to do this after all, because I thought I was almost done. But she was right, and over the course of 4 months in late 2018, I rewrote the second half of the book to change the plot points, and went on to the agent showcase, did not get an agent from that, but started querying, got an agent a few months later, and then I found out the book sold March 6th, 2020. So in the middle of everything starting to happen. And I got to announce it the following week on March 13th, which was incidentally the last day I was in the office. And then I never went back to that job. I started a new job a couple of months ago.
Adios, muchachos.
Yes, adios. Yes, so it was quite an adventure debuting in a pandemic. And again, not to intentionally go political, but the release party for A Deadly Fortune, the first book, was supposed to be held in Arlington at a bookstore on January 6th, 2021.
Oh my.
And at about 4:30 that afternoon, the bookstore called and said, look, we really need to postpone. And then I cried and was very sorry for myself and ate some cheesecake. And my writers group, 3 of whom are here today, thank you so much, they threw me an impromptu Zoom launch party, and it was lovely.
Oh my goodness.
But yeah. So the beginning, so like the bookend, that book is bookended by political upheaval and chaos.
Excellent. So. Okay, well, but it got you to a good space. So to get into the book, the characters that we meet in A Deadly Fortune and then carry through into The Unquiet Dead. The protagonist is Amelia Matthew, her foster brother, Jonas Vincent, and then a variety of cast of characters, some of which carry through from the first book to the second book. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I really am fascinated about, so when people talk about historical fiction, it is a vast tent when you say historical fiction, because you can pick Edwardian England of a certain year and write your entire career could be books about that particular, right? So when people say, oh, I love historical fiction, you got to say, oh, you got to be more specific than that, because every genre that you could ever think of has a subgenre in historical fiction. So one of the things that I was wondering about is how, in fact, as you're deciding to write a book, you specifically choose New York in the Gilded Age in 1893, 92, 93, and so how you zeroed in on that period.
It's my favorite period to read. You know, I felt like I could write the voice of that period without having to strain too much, because I love Deanna Raybourn. I love all of the sort of Gilded Age set mysteries. That's just my favorite time period. That and probably the Tudor period. And I find the Gilded Age sort of easier to understand as a modern reader. The motivations, people are very much the same, and the motivations are the same, and it's a period that feels distant enough to feel sort of exotic, and of course the clothing and the Victorian era manners are very, very fun to write around, but it's also modern enough that it feels very familiar in a lot of ways. You know, things like elevators were coming into being, and telephones, and sort of that kind of modern. It's really very modern in a lot of ways. Electric lighting was taking off in big cities, so it doesn't feel so distant that it feels like there's a ton of world explaining to need to do. And it's just my favorite. It's my favorite place and time and place.
But you also get down into the muck of the ankle-deep manure and mud that made up the streets, and the cart horses that die in their traces every day and have to be dragged off the street, and there's traffic jams because of the dead horses in the middle of the street.
Yes.
So you can almost smell. And a lot of this takes place in the summer, in the heat of summer. So you can feel New York. On a day like today, you can kind of appreciate, what that must be
Modern
like.
sanitation is a miracle we should be grateful for every day.
It makes you feel it.
And A Deadly Fortune and The Unquiet Dead are different. A Deadly Fortune takes place over a longer time span.
Right.
And then The Unquiet Dead takes place over 5 days. So the pacing is very different, and it's much faster. And The Unquiet Dead does happen in the summer. And it was really important to me to... I love historical detail. I love accurate renderings of historical times and places, and those little details that really are real. And so every detail in my books that I can make accurate is accurate. A Deadly Fortune takes place largely in the Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum. And so all of my research about the asylum and the things that took place there, that's all from historical records. It's all accurate and that sort of thing. It's just really important to me to bring in the feel of the time and place.
Right. And one of the things that I've felt is genius, how you...
Genius.
It is.
I will take that word.
There you go. Is how you selected. So Amelia and Jonas are the two major characters through both books, and I'm gonna guess that there might be a third that I'm looking forward to. We'll talk about that later. But one of the things that you do is that the place in society that you slide Amelia and Jonas is they have a foot in the high society, but they absolutely come from the underclass, and they are absolutely children of the underclass, and they know how to struggle to survive. They have had to scrape, but now they have their feet in this sort of upper class society, and that's a wonderful perspective to bring both of those things together and sort of highlight, lay out for the reader the different concepts of the social milieu that you're looking at. So
Amelia and Jonas are orphans. They are found family. They consider each other brother and sister, but they're not blood related. And they grew up in the Children's Orphan Asylum, the Catholic Orphans Asylum. And Amelia has always had, just to put a little bit of context around who we're talking about here, Amelia has always had a very, very modest psychic talent, like tiny intuitions, nothing dramatic as a rule. And in the first book, they've been grifters mostly. They use that to swindle people and to make their way as orphans. And in the first book, they have found a place. Amelia tells fortunes, and Jonas is a bouncer and sometime prostitute at a high society, underground sort of risque nightclub. And early in the first book, Amelia is injured, and she wakes up from her head injury with a much more dramatically expanded ability, and she is now able to channel the dead. And she winds up in the asylum on Blackwell's Island. And so I wanted them to be able to straddle both of those worlds. They are very much of the underclass. They are very much disadvantaged in that way. But because they're both smart and hardworking and strivers and good con artists, they're able to ape the manners and understand the upper class world. And now working in this nightclub, they see a lot of that. They see how people carry themselves. They see how people talk, how they dress, how they spend money. And so they're able to sort of straddle that divide in a way that a lot of people didn't have the ability to do, I think, at that time.
And it brings a lot of depth, because if we were just looking at it from, oftentimes authors are drawn to writing about
The glitzy parts.
The glitzy, exactly, the glitzy part of it all. And when you're from that perspective, you get to look down on everything else and be separated from it, whereas Jonas and Amelia are completely they are aware, they know how life is really lived in a way that if they had been brought up in a coddled environment, they would never understand, and it brings a lot of depth to their...
Well, and I think it's another one of those sort of universal truths, is that wealthy people in any time and place are insulated from what's happening beneath them. They don't get the same perspective. They don't understand the day-to-day lived realities of people who don't have the means that they do. And it was really important to me to bring both of those perspectives in, and to call out some of those wealthy people, even the sympathetic ones who are allies of Jonas and Amelia, who don't understand their own blind spots and don't understand the world as it is for a lot of people who didn't grow up as privileged as they did.
Right. Well, it's really funny because throughout both books, there's a developing relationship between Amelia and Andrew Kavanaugh, who is a doctor. He's a doctor at the insane asylum in Blackwell's Island. They sort of partner in the first book, and now in the second book he gets drawn in because of the mystery that they're trying to solve in that 5-day period. And truly one of my favorite lines in the whole book is Amelia has been holding herself back from allowing herself to get involved with Andrew, who comes from an extraordinarily privileged background and family. He's slightly estranged from his family, but he's getting to, back with them. And he's pressing her for a relationship, and she's trying to explain to him how this is not going to work. And my favorite line is she looks at him and says, "Who does your laundry?" And he's like, What do you mean, who does my laundry?
I don't know. It's included in the price of my room.
Exactly.
Somebody just does it.
I put it out and it comes back. And she says, that is exactly it, right? I'm the one who does the laundry. You're the one who just magically expects it to appear. And so I just felt like that sort of cut to the chase of, she sees very clearly how many expectations that he has that he doesn't even know he has. And that's one of the interesting conversations that they have about all these expectations that he has that he's not even aware of.
Yeah, and that she's never going to be, and she's very aware that she's not going to be able to meet.
Right.
I love it when people have favorite lines. That's such a flattering thing as an author when somebody engaged with a book deeply enough to have a moment and be like, yes, I love that line.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I was afraid it was going to be one of those books where they never have the conversation. Each of them is thinking what they're thinking, but they're thinking it separately, and they never say anything.
No, I hate it when books do that.
Exactly.
I hate it when books do that. When problems can be resolved by a conversation and are not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there are definite conversations in this book about laying it out on the line, and I really, really appreciated that. And truly, there are so many things in both books to talk about where we have issues of race, we have issues of certainly of class, you have issues of
gender and sexuality.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah. So, woman's role, sexuality. So Jonas is gay, which is completely, basically unremarked upon in the milieu that Amelia and Jonas inhabit. But sorry, that was a bug. It's something that Andrew can't quite wrap his head around because again. Those people are deviants. And then Jonas also has a very privileged lover, who's Sydney, who is a lawyer. So we have a privileged doctor and a privileged lawyer who are the romantic interests for Jonas and Amelia.
Yes.
So again, bringing in that, this is how the privileged class lives, and this is how everybody else lives.
The reality of it for everybody else.
Right.
And it's so funny. I didn't set out with A Deadly Fortune to write a feminist paranormal historical mystery thriller. But as soon as it came out, people started calling it feminist novels and talking about the feminist overtones of it. And I was like, well, all right, I'm a fish in that particular water, so I guess that was inevitable that was going to come out. But and it worked out. It was kind of happenstance that I ended up talking about gender and sexuality as much as I did. Initially, I wasn't looking to do that. I wanted to make Jonas gay because I didn't want there to be any question about his and Amelia's relationship and the nature of it. But then once I had done that, it seemed so obvious that here was another way to explore a taboo and a particular underclass and a particular social stratum in that time period, because of course there were gay and lesbian people and couples and social gatherings and that sort of social circle, and being able to really explore that brought another dimension to the series, to both books that I hadn't initially been looking to bring in. And it was really funny because I had the idea for the second book before I had finished writing the first one. So I already had the ending, I had the characters, I knew, and I didn't start writing it yet. I wrote a little bit of it after I finished Deadly Fortune because it was fresh in my mind and I wanted to get it down. But Deadly Fortune sold as a single book, and I didn't have a contract for the sequel, and my agent said to me, look, it's not a good use of your time to write a sequel when there's not a contract on it and it's not something we could take to another publisher.
Gotcha.
So she said, put that aside and I'd like to see you working on something else. And so I put it aside, and in the meantime, the Black Lives Matter movement really rose to prominence after George Floyd was murdered. And because the second book centers around the kidnapping and murder of a young white child and a black teenager is accused, I really took a step back and thought, should I even write this? You know, there's a lot of ways for a well-meaning white lady to get racial politics wrong. And I wanted to be really thoughtful about how I approached that. And I had a sensitivity reader, I had a wonderful sensitivity reader who talked through some of the issues with me and read the final manuscript and sort of, you know, gave it the thumbs up. But I wanted to be really, really careful and really, really thoughtful about how I approached race in the second book, because race was not as much a part of the first book, but it is very much present in the second book.
Correct. And so that is one of those challenges, as you say, and you even address it in the book about people who use their privilege to help, and maybe are they really helping, but they're able to help because they are privileged.
Yes, and it was also, you know, writing in 2021, 2022, writing characters in 1893. There's a real balancing act between writing characters who are likable, but who are not so far ahead of their time on sort of social issues that they still feel plausible for their time.
Right.
And I didn't want to write it in a way that felt ahistorical, but I didn't also want to ignore the very present realities of race and whiteness and the way we white people react to race. So.
And again, you had Amelia who sort of struggled with the fact that the doctor, who was black, was giving her orders, and she was sort of taken aback by that, and she was stunned by seeing that that Polly and Miles were an interracial couple, and they specifically lived in the one neighborhood in Brooklyn that would actually allow them
where that was comfortable.
That was okay, right? Exactly.
And so Miles and Polly in the second book, in The Unquiet Dead, it's their son who is accused of murdering this child, and Miles works as a waiter at the club, and that is how that Jonas and Amelia get drawn in. Miles and Polly are based on a real couple. They're based on a historically real couple named Morgan and Annie Austin, and they were a real interracial couple. Morgan Austin worked as a waiter, and that's how the story for the second one came about. Is I was researching the Greenwich Village neighborhood where the club is located, and I ran across a blog that talked about Morgan and Annie Austin, and Morgan Austin was a waiter, and they had a son who worked in a laundry, and I was just like, oh, that's the second book. That's the core of it.
Right.
And so they were real, and I wrote the whole book writing Morgan and Annie Austen, and then at the end I was like, all right, I should probably change their names. So I still have a hard time remembering that they are Miles and Polly, because they're Morgan and Annie in my head. But yeah, they were real people, and they lived in that neighborhood during that time period. They had a 15-year-old son who worked at a laundry.
Wow.
So.
Okay, so we have a couple more minutes before we're going to start taking questions. So just be thinking of your questions. We're going to have somebody with a microphone to come around. So I'm going to ask one or two more, and then you guys get to jump in with your questions. So truly, one of the things that I wonder about is as you describe now, it is a historical feminist paranormal mystery thriller.
Yes.
Exactly. That's a lot of stuff going on there. And so one of the things that I wondered about is, to me, pulling off paranormal is challenging, to make sure you don't lose your readers into making it be, oh, it's a deus ex machina, right? That this is how we're going to solve the problem, right? Because poof, something happens. But you're handling it extraordinarily well. So how did you do that?
So I wanted it to be, I didn't want to write a straight paranormal book. So I wanted the paranormal aspects to be a light touch. I wanted it to feel very historically grounded, very much of our world. And I'm a huge fan of The Alienist. It's one of my all-time favorite books. And so I pitched this to myself and to my agent as The Alienist if Sarah Howard were psychic, but also a little less gory, because The Alienist is very, very explicit in its violence. And I was like, let's dial that back. And there's no eyeballs in jars in my book. But I wanted the paranormal to be a light touch. And so one of the rules when I was writing it was that Amelia's ability had to get her in more trouble than it did help. Like, it had to be more hindrance than anything. And it definitely couldn't be, in both books it does come into play in the finale, but it couldn't be something so straightforward as, I mean, if you've got a psychic investigating a murder, you just summon the victim and ask who did it, and it can't be that easy. There's no book there if you do that. So it had to be still a problematic ability. Amelia is stronger, but she's not totally in control of that new ability. It's very much sort of ruining her life rather than making it better. So I wanted that to, like I said, be a very a thread, but not the whole story.
Okay. All right. And what is the thing that you would like everybody to know most about either what this book means, both books together, or this book in particular, what it means to you, what it has...
on a personal level, that I'm just so proud of myself for having done this. I went from being afraid to try to deciding that it was worth trying even if it didn't work out, and it has worked out beyond my expectations. I've written 2 books, and I'm really proud of both of them. From the reader's perspective, the thing that is not necessarily apparent when reading is the level of historical accuracy. I put in details that I think of as Easter eggs for myself. They are not necessarily relevant to the plot, but if I can make something accurate, why wouldn't I do that? So, for example, my favorite few details. Early in the first book, there's an area where Jonas is reading newspaper headlines to Amelia over breakfast. And all of those newspaper headlines are actual New York Times headlines from approximately the week the book would have been taking place.
Oh, wow.
Because those exist, and if I can go get those, why wouldn't I, instead of just making them up? At one point in the first book, there's a telephone call. There's a couple places where there's a telephone used, and I was writing the book, and I was like, I really need the asylum to have a telephone for this to work. Telephones were around in 1893, but how far had they penetrated? Were they really a thing? And I started Googling, trying to find out, and God bless whoever did this, but someone had taken an actual 1893 New York City Services telephone directory and scanned it online.
Oh my.
And I found the actual telephone number of the Blackwell's Island Insane Asylum. And so when they make that phone call, the telephone number that they use is the actual telephone number. And that doesn't change the book. Nobody needs to know that. That's for me, but I tell everybody every chance I get because that's just so cool.
That is cool.
So I do a lot of that. Like if there's a detail, if there's a particular detail, it's probably accurate because I do that whenever I can.
Excellent.
So
wow.
now you know one of the secrets that I put it in because it tickled something in my soul to have the actual telephone number in the book, but it is in the book. So.
All right, well, so we are open to
logistics.
Okay.
If you have a question, please raise your hand. Harvey's taking a microphone around. He is holding the microphone. Do not
attempt to take the microphone.
Do not back away from him. He knows how far to hold it from your mouth. Okay?
Okay. We have one. Yep. He's holding it. Yeah, he's gonna hold it.
I read a lot of Reese Bowman, who writes in that period, and one of the things in one of her books, in the afternote, was she didn't apologize for using the terms that were used in the time, that was accurate for the time. I was curious if you get emails and things that people object to that, or because it belongs in the time. It belongs, just like all racial feelings belong in that time.
So I made the decision, and I went back and forth about it because like the N-word would be time appropriate, and I made the decision that I was not going to use it. So in the second book, in The Unquiet Dead, I imply that someone has said it a few times, and sort of someone another sound drowns out the use of an epithet, but I don't actually use the word. And I decided that I didn't need to, and I do not quarrel with other writers who decide that they do need to, but I decided that for this particular time and place and the particular moment that we're in, using that word would be lazy, and I could get around it without doing it, and it was needless, so I just decided I wasn't going to use it. But the racial attitudes are still very much there, and I do use terms for gay men that I wouldn't use, I would never use, and we don't use today, but again, historically accurate. But so I try not to shy away from harsh language and vulgarity, because those are real, and those are but that one line was one that I drew for myself. I wasn't going to use that word. So
I think I saw somebody else's hand up here from our reading group.
From my writers group, 4 of them are here. Thank you.
I apologize if you've answered this question, but can you read the second book without reading the first book?
So I as the author, I was not entirely sure of that, but I've already had 2 people today tell me that they did read the second book without reading the first book, and it was fine. So, but obviously I would like you to buy and read both of them. But.
Exactly. It does add depth. When you know the characters already and you understand where they come from, I think it does add depth. But you can absolutely, because I read them out of order, and they were wonderful. So,
what next?
What next? I hope that there is a book 3 in the series. I am not under contract, so again, buy both books so that my publisher will decide that they want a book 3. I have an idea for it. I would love for this to be a series of at least 5 books. I have rough ideas for at least 5. In the meantime, I'm working on, again, I'm not under contract for it, but I'm working on a standalone about a young witch in Denver during the Civil War. Ooh. So that's going to be a little more paranormal, but yeah.
Okay. Did we have a hand up over here?
We did.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, you're on.
I'm on. Okay, you talked about a sensitivity reader, and so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that experience. If you drove that experience, who drove that experience, the selection?
I had in my head that that was probably something we needed to do. I'm with a smaller publisher, so they weren't eager to spring for it. One of my late beta readers really strongly suggested that I do it, and I was like, all right, so yes, I'm actually going to do that myself out of pocket. And so I went online and I found a woman who is a book blogger and a black woman who does sensitivity reading, and I did an agreement with her, and I sent her the file, and she read it and made notes throughout, and then did a reader's report where she told me, you know, here are the things that I noticed, and here's where I thought you handled them well. Here's where I think maybe we could tweak a little bit. And, you know, she didn't change the substance of the book. Overall, her report was very positive. And it was also kind of fun, you know, because I'd been giving pieces of it to my writers group or to my mom or to people. Like, I'd been talking about the book a lot with people in my circle. But it was really, really fun to get a close read from a total outsider who, you know, hadn't read the first one, didn't know anything about the characters, and she, you know, she did a lot of inline comments, not just about the parts that I had asked her to sensitivity read, but like, haha, at things that I thought were funny, and I was like, yes, she thought it was funny. So it was really interesting and fun to see what landed with her, like what parts that she liked, and she also picked up on the laundry thing and a few other things where I was like, okay, I was hoping that would land the way I meant for it to land, and her reaction was that it did, and so that was really fun. So it was a really, really good process, and I don't mean to pat myself on the back again as a well-meaning white lady. There are a lot of ways I could have gotten it wrong, but I had put a lot of thought and done a lot of reading and tried to be really, really aware of, you know, I've got white main characters, and I didn't want them to be saviors. I didn't want them to be like swooping in to save this black boy. And so I wanted to make sure that I put in another black character. So I introduced the doctor, who had some authority, who could sort of, and so that the reaction that Amelia has to him, you know, he's taking charge in medical situations, and she's kind of finding herself bristling at being talked to this way by a black man, but not really realizing her own biases or why she's doing it, and having somebody call her out on that later. So I didn't want my main characters to be white saviors, and I didn't want them to be too perfect or enlightened. I wanted them to have their biases. And so I did put a lot of thought and effort into that, and I was really pleased that my sensitivity reader saw that and did say that I had managed it. So that was yeah.
While we're waiting for somebody else to think of their question, one of the things I wanted to ask about is the concept of understanding the medical practices of the time and knowing. So, for example, there's a rather gory scene of childbirth.
There's a childbirth scene.
And needing to go in for the afterbirth that did not release naturally. And they talk about Halstead gloves. And so obviously you had read up about that. And so understanding what the medical practice of the time included.
So I did have that be a little bit ahead of its time. The Halstead glove major publication, I think, didn't come out until 1894, but I was like, well, there could have been earlier talk about it, and somebody who stayed up on the literature, like this doctor stays up on that kind of thing, he might have heard about it and have been persuaded. So I was like, I can move that 6 months earlier, that's okay. So not quite historically accurate, and I feel a little guilty about it, but I wanted this character to survive this harrowing childbirth.
Exactly.
And I introduced a pregnant character, Polly Austin is pregnant, and I was like, this is like Chekhov's gun. A pregnant lady in a book has to go into labor at the most inconvenient time. That is the rule of writing pregnant ladies in books. They have to give birth when it's really inconvenient. And so but I wanted her to have a chance of surviving, and a procedure like that at that time period, without some infection control, she would have not had good odds. Exactly. So I wanted her to live, so I gave her, which I guess I've just spoiled for people, she lives. But so I gave the doctor a sterile glove to use, a sterile rubber glove.
So we have one.
Hi, Stacie. How are you?
Hi.
I have a quick question about your writing process and discipline and how you organize your time around that.
My time is so disorganized. I wish I had a writing process. A Deadly Fortune was written, like I said, my daughter was very young, so she went to bed very early. So as soon as we put her to bed, I would sit down and write in the evenings. I wrote during nap times on the weekends. Any Monday or Friday holiday that I had off from work when we had childcare, I treated those like work days. And I had pretty generous vacation at my job, and so several times during that year, I literally blocked off a week, and I took the week off, and I wrote like it was my job during those weeks. I would get up in the morning, have breakfast, sit down at 8 o'clock, and write until 5 p.m. And that was how I got that one done. The Unquiet Dead was a different process because I got the contract for it in April 2001. I'd written about 20,000 words of it before I had set it aside, and I had an outline, but the publisher wanted to publish. They initially wanted to publish it this past January, and I was like, I cannot. I have a child and a husband and a day job, and I cannot physically produce a book quickly enough. So it came out in April. So I wrote 60,000 words in 60 days for that one to get the draft done, because I worked back from the time that it had to be turned in to I need my betas, I need time for revision, it's got to go to my agent. So I just blocked off, and I was like, here are my hit points. By this date, I have to have another 10,000 words, 10,000 words, 10,000 words. And I was working from home during the pandemic, fortunately, and that really was the only reason I was able to do it. And I did that book and I was really worried about it. I was really worried about if it was any good because I wrote it so fast. Like, I just really wasn't sure. Because I motored on that one, and I do not wish to do that again. I was so burned out after that one that I didn't really write anything else in 2021 because I was just done. I was just done. I didn't even look at my computer. So.
And it came out just last month, so
yes.
Fresh off the presses.
Yes.
So now you are going to sort of take a little bit of downtime.
I took a little downtime, and I just in the last couple of months I have picked back up the witch book that I have been dabbling at and getting started on it. I mean, I'm getting excited enough about it to actually want to work on it, so that's nice. So.
Excellent.
Because there was definitely the Unquiet Dead. It was like writing a book under contract and on a deadline is a whole different experience from writing your first book when it's like, if this takes 10 years, it's fine.
Nobody's asking for it, right?
Nobody's begging me for it. I don't have to pay back in advance if I don't get it written. Yeah, so the second one was on a tight turnaround and under deadline, and I felt like I spat that out in a hurry.
Wow. Well, it does not look like it.
Thank
you. Does not show it. So do we have any more questions from the audience?
Do you have a favorite character in your book, and if so, who is it?
Jonas is my favorite character. I love Jonas so much. He's so brilliant and arrogant, and he's just so much fun. He's just so much fun to write. He's so smart. He's so smart, but he's not educated. He's completely self-educated. He's vain. He's
sort of a bad boy.
Sort of a bad boy. Likes to fight. But he's so much fun. He loves Amelia so much. She is his family, and that bond between them. But I love writing him. He's fun. And so before we close out, I will say that I am local, and I love doing book clubs. So if you decide you want to read Deadly Fortune or Unquiet Dead for your book club, I would love for you to do that, and I would love to come be a part of it because I adore doing book clubs. So
they're always lots of fun.
Yes.
Absolutely.
And I make it a policy of staying long enough to answer all questions, but leaving early enough that you can talk about the parts you didn't like without having to do it in front of me. So.
and bring a bottle of wine.
Yes.
To smooth everything over. Absolutely.